That was a recording of Makoto Nakura performing a short section from my piece Gaian Pulse for Marimba and computer-generated soundtrack. I chose this piece because it occurs to me that the myth of Gaia, like that of Iphigenia, can reveal a great deal about the relationship between mind and nature. I've come to Schloss Ettersburg, just a few kilometres north of Weimar, to talk about these things, and in particular to look for a chimerical quail. It's possible I won't find one, even though these used to be hunting grounds popular with the Weimar ducal court, because this particular game fowl is not only a wild bird, but it's a wildly fanciful bird, and a product of the imagination. But I've come to look anyway. Many of the modern theories pertaining to the relationship between mind and nature that I've looked at have been primarily oriented on explaining mental processes, level 3 of my original mind map. There's been a tendency to disregard level 2, the reflective conscious mind, or at best treat it as a part of level 3. For instance, the semantics of functionalism, which I considered in episode 42, draws a simple machine receiving inputs from external stimuli, processing the data by way of some kind of semantic or syntactical machine, and then creating external behaviour. It's a model that completely leaves out the qualitative states of consciousness. Eliminative materialism, which I considered in the last episode, identifies all mental states with physical states before reducing everything of the former to the latter. It doesn't give any kind of explanation pertaining to level 2 consciousness, other than to imply this is subject to eliminativism too. In both of these models, the Gaian pulse is disregarded. This is the spirit of the earth, as perceived by humanity, that which cannot be seen or tested empirically, that which is experienced qualitatively as the essence of the world, and which in itself embodies ethics and aesthetics. It has its roots in pagan mysticism, its etymological origins in ancient Greek, and it can be said to be the ancient equivalent of the one god described by monolithic religion. Yet Gaia is banished, along with the chimerical quail, conceivable but not real, along with all folk psychology, by the eliminativist, non-pluralist ontology associated with neuroscience. The omission of the most central part of mind, that which determines the phenomenal substance of all knowledge, has been made by theorists who've come to this same park, metaphysically speaking, and failed to find or even explain the problem of the chimerical quail, otherwise called absent quailium. They've been unable to see the trees for the forest, or the forest for the trees, one or the other, and they've resorted to the easy way out, to refuting that consciousness is irreducible, by asserting that Gaia and all art can simply be left out of any explanation of the mind. I need to find the chimerical quail in these woods because that's quite a shift from the era of the Weimar identity thesis. Thomas Nagel asks his readers to imagine what it might feel like to be a bat in these woods using radar. Furthermore, he asks them to imagine a scientist of the future studying the bat and able to determine how every synapse in the bat brain works, yet unable to explain consciousness. Nagel speculated it will be a theory that outlines the complete physiology of radar and yet is unable to explain what the bat feels when it uses its radar. He added that the same stance could be applied to all animals with senses unknown to human experience, such as dolphin radar or birds using the Earth's magnetic field to navigate. These thought experiments show that when the qualitative field of consciousness included in any physicalist-based theory pertaining to mind and brain, then that theory necessarily provides an incomplete explanation. Frank Jackson introduced a similar example pertaining to Mary the super scientist, who's an expert on colour. She's a leading expert on both the physics of light and the physiology of light perception, but unfortunately she's colourblind herself and has never actually seen colours. But then, dramatically, she gains colour vision for the first time, perhaps by way of a miraculous operation, and she discovers something that has never come out of her research, the qualitative experience of perceiving those colours. She realises that her physicalist account of the perception of colour had not included the chimerical quail. She sees it only by way of phenomenal experience. How can subjective experience be integrated with the principle of mind-body identity? What does it mean in objective terms for metaphysics to encompass multiple ontologies? I want to look at two theories that have tried to solve these problems in the early 21st century, both of which can be seen to show the influence of the Weimar identity thesis. First, I'll take a brief look at what is confusingly called biological identity theory, which seeks to be a naturalist theory compatible with modern neuroscience, and then panpsychism, which seeks to extend the domain of naturalism beyond its current nomological constraints. Duchess Anna Amalia of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach held her summer court here at the Ettersburg castle in the years immediately after the fire in Weimar Schloss. It became a hub of literary and musical activity. Goethe's Iphigenia was first performed here, with Goethe in the role of Orestes. But it was also well known for its hunting trails. Even if those hunters on horseback were also looking for the Chimerical Quail, as I am, I'm sure they too would have been confused by the idea of a biological identity theory. So let me explain. Biological identity theory agrees with token-token identity theory that there is equivalence between mind and body. It describes different levels of description that mean the same thing. A causal event may be described in terms of cellular or molecular activity and in terms of mental states at the same time. These do not pertain to different substances or different properties, which would suggest dualism, but are different descriptions of the same causal event. As with material identity theory, this approach means that high-level descriptions are reducible to lower-level ones. Biological identity theory, such as that described by John Searle, is different to material identity theory and more similar to Weimar identity theory in that it separates ontological commitment to a causality from that of physical entity. It starts by asserting that identities are a description of a single causal event, and that therefore it's reasonable to think in terms of a causal reduction. This is the same as the links between lightning and the movement of free electrons, or between water and H2O that I considered in episode 33. However, this doesn't imply there's a corresponding ontological reduction. Schelling had argued that objective investigation of nature must be balanced against subjective introspection, whereby phenomenal perception enables the subject to identify natural forces as analogous to mental states. Similarly, John Searle argued that the subjective nature of the mind means that its ontology cannot be reduced to the mind-independent objective. Even if two descriptions share the same causal link, the two ontological levels, which he characterises as the subjective and the objective, remain separate. This is a principle supported by simultaneous level identity, which I considered in the last episode. It refutes the notion of eliminativism and asserts the central place of consciousness. An entirely different approach is that of panpsychism. In a position similar to that of Hegel, it argues that qualities of human conscious experience supervene not on the human body, but on an absolute or fundamental level of existence that permeates the intrinsic nature of things. It posits that consciousness is not exclusive to humans or sentient animals, but that all matter and all phenomena possess the seeds of consciousness, from the largest macroscopic levels of galaxies to the smallest microscopic level of physical particles. It's an approach that redefines the division between the mental and the material as an artificial one. Panpsychism, albeit in different forms, has a long history. Archaeological digs have suggested that pre-Roman societies in Europe entertained the notion of a world soul. Similarly, in ancient Greek mythology, it was the goddess Gaia nominated as the intrinsic apotheosis of the world. More recently, in the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell suggested that phenomenal qualities will always remain elusive until science understands the intrinsic nature of things. I'll look at Russellian monism in greater depth in episode 49. One of the leading exponents of panpsychism and Russellian monism over the past 2 decades has been David Chalmers, who by coincidence spoke at the University of Göttingen about 100 kilometres or so from here a couple of years ago about consciousness and its links to the collapse of the wave function described by quantum field theory. He pointed out that the standard explanation for rejecting dualism is the causally closed nature of physics, yet the wave collapse process associated with quantum measurement and human interaction with the physical world leaves a potential causal opening in physics. In his other writings, in support of the metaphysical possibility of consciousness acting as a fundamental entity in the universe, Chalmers has used Kripke's semantics of rigid designation to argue against the necessity of physics as causally closed. To do this, he has extended the range of possible world semantics, argued that there are different ways to determine possible worlds other than nomologically. Anything that can possibly be imagined could represent a possible world, including the fact that natural kinds might have been other than that revealed in the actual world as necessary a posteriori. In his article, Does Conceivability Entail Possibility?, Chalmers said, "One argues that some state of affairs is conceivable, and from there one concludes that this state of affairs is possible. Here, the kind of possibility at issue is metaphysical possibility, as opposed to physical possibility, natural possibility, and other sorts of possibility." In this way, Chalmers sought to address this problem and reconnect meaning, reason, and modality through a revamped invocation of dualism. He refined Kripke's possible world semantics to show how the epistemic fallibility of rigid designation, designed to support physicalism, actually undermines it. I've created a set of slides to explain Chalmers' dualist system of two-dimensional semantics, or at least how I understand it, so as to be able to explain things more clearly. Two-dimensional semantics are a restructuring of Kripke's division of singular terms into definite descriptions and rigid designators, the latter including names and natural kind terms. Looking at the example, the top horizontal level of semantics deals with the descriptive attributes of a term. These are the epistemic functional operators. In the case of water, it's true that water is colourless and tasteless. It falls as rain to make rivers, etc. These are all contingent descriptions, or facts about water discovered a posteriori, or empirically. They might have been otherwise. Water might have not been colourless and tasteless if human sense had evolved differently. There might have been no rain if planet Earth had been a desert planet, in which case the boxes would have had different descriptions able to act in the function so as to provide a truth value. The point is, these are all nomological possibilities, meaning they're possibilities within the bounds of the laws of science. The second level of semantics deals with the essence of that subject. This is a modal operator. Water is a chemical compound H2O by necessity. I've made it red just to emphasize it in the graphic. The essence of water is that property that must necessarily be the case for the term to exist. This is Kripke's rigid designator. In the case of water, the fact that water is H2O is something that was discovered empirically, and thereafter, given it's not possible to have water that's not H2O, taken to be a necessary truth. So this level deals with truth by way of necessary a posteriori knowledge. In this case, necessity is defined by the bounds of science. The second level of semantics defines the limits within which the first level can operate. In other words, the second level represents the totality of all possible worlds, whereby the essence of a term exists in all of them, while the first level represents the different possibilities within that totality. Example 2 shows another similar example, this time using the historical figure Beethoven. The top level shows contingent descriptions about Beethoven, things that are true as far as is known, but which might not have been true. Beethoven composed music, but he might not have done so, perhaps if he'd lived anywhere other than Vienna. Beethoven went deaf later in life, but he might not have done so if healthcare had been better in his era. The bottom level shows necessary truth. Again, it's in red just to emphasize it. Beethoven might have lived his life in different ways, but Beethoven cannot have been anybody other than himself, assuming he was born in the first place. Again, this is Kripke's rigid designator, shown as a second-level semantic. In my third example, I've applied this structure to the issue of mind-body. I've taken the brain as representative of the physical world to be necessary function, and I've written it in red to emphasize it. Actually, it's not yet been possible to determine the two-dimensional semantics for the brain empirically, and so this is a hypothetical chart. It shows what descriptive attributes might be taken to be the case, if and only if the brain was taken as identical to the mind as a necessary function. If the brain-mind identity is taken as a rigid designator, in the same way that water and H2O were before, then functional systems and conscious states will be taken as contingent descriptive attributes. However, there's a problem with this example. As I discussed in a previous episode, functionalists have argued that functional systems are not dependent upon brain-mind identity. Consciousness might contingently be created in other ways, perhaps through artificial intelligence or through the brain equivalent of a silicon-based alien. Functionalists argue that brain-mind identity, if true, is a contingent fact. Watch what happens if I apply this to the chart. Example 3 shows brain-mind identity, emphasised in red, as a necessary truth in the second semantic level. In example 4, I've taken the cue from functionalists, who've argued that if it is possible to create an artificial intelligence that possessed consciousness, this would demonstrate consciousness is not dependent upon a particular physical system. I've taken mind-brain identity to be a contingent fact and moved it to the first level of semantics. Now it's possible for mind to be created in other contingent ways, besides through the brain. But if this is the case, what is the necessary truth that underpins this and shows the essence of mind? Chalmers, if I understand him right, says there are two alternatives. Firstly, it could be taken as necessarily true that physicalism is not necessary, based upon the contingent fact that not all contingencies are physical. This fits the structure, however, non-physicalism is not an essence in itself. Chalmers said the other alternative is panpsychism, whereby consciousness is a necessary component of all things. It permeates the universe as a fundamental force. Chalmers said this is not only a response to the question of how consciousness might arise from non-conscious things, it's the only explanation of the functionalist account, and it's the only solution to Kripke's separation of reason and meaning. Let me put this in perspective by paraphrasing things as a story. Once upon a time, Descartes proposed two worlds, the mental and the physical. But then modern naturalism and scientific realism, in the absence of Weimar, swung the pendulum back the other way. It refuted both idealism and dualism and insisted the world is entirely physical, whereby reality exists external to the mind. But then physicalist externalism itself implied an acceptance of functionalism, which in turn contradicted itself by denying the necessity of physical externalism and thus supported the notion of pluralism, which in turn explains the purposiveness behind people like me coming into the woods in search of the Gaian pulse and the chimerical quail. Thanks for listening.